All right, so Stephen, do you have a question directed at one of the presenters that you thought was extremely good that we didn't have time for?
Well, I would say I would love to hear, not to put you on the spot there now, but Dr. Wendland, if you would expound on your very excellent answers you gave to Edward Fry's question, which was never actually asked live. He had a couple of different ones. I don't know if I could read them, but I think it might just be good just for you to expound on that topic.
Well, I think the question, as he's asking them, is what is the relationship between our created humanity and the permeation of sin, original sin? I really found the Formula of Concord's solid declaration very helpful on that, because they draw, this is going back into history, but sometimes history is useful, isn't it? Anyway, there was a wonderful Lutheran theologian by the name of Flacius who went too far. He ended up saying that original sin was part of our essential nature. And the confessors of the Formula of Concord drew a distinction. It worked perhaps a little bit easier within their thought world because they had Aristotle as kind of a distinction between essence and accidents, but that's really beside the point. The idea is that they were able to say, look, our human nature, as coming from the hand of our Creator, is still God's good work. It is still God's good work, even though it has been permeated by and penetrated through and through by sin. Even though you can say on the one hand, it is corrupted by sin, yet on the other hand, it is still God's good work, and God creates us sons and daughters of Adam in such a way as to cleanse us from sin. So I was trying to draw that distinction between substance and accidents by saying, look, I'm a man that has gray hair now. I once had brown hair. I'm still the same person that I was before I had gray hair. So in a sense, the gray is just, it's part of my nature. You can look at me and say I'm a gray-haired person. But the essential me has not changed. I think that's perhaps one helpful way of thinking about the distinction. I also wanted to be clear that I'm not saying that humanity is essentially good. It isn't. When you say humanity is essentially good, what you're saying is that we are by nature good and not corrupted by sin. Rather, what I'm trying to say is that our being, our body and soul being, is God's good creature. God made us that way, even though we have made a mess of things. Maybe another analogy might be helpful. Let's say I'm a cook and I'm making a batch of dough. I use good flour, I use good eggs, I use good yeast, and I make a wonderful batch of dough. And then an enemy comes along and puts into that batch of dough sand or dirt. The whole batch of dough is really corrupted. I mean, nobody is going to eat a piece of bread made from that kind of dough. And yet at the same time, you can still see the intention of the Creator in that essential ingredients of the batch of dough without the sand as coming from a good cook, even though an enemy messed it up. So when we're talking about the distinction between nature and creation, especially as the Formula of Concord Solid Declaration sets it out, that's really what we mean. We are still God's good work, even though we are corrupted by sin. He also asked a question about the image of God, but I think I probably used more than my time, so I'll shut up now.
And one of the things about this panel discussions, we also allow other panelists to address the same question if they so desire, which gets a little risky, of course, in case there's some slight differences. But anyway, Stephen, do you have another question for us from somebody online?
Sure. From Stefan Valesky, in regard to Dr. Veith's presentation, excellent presentation, do you see red flags in our current administration that give concern dismissal of agencies, silencing of voices in medical community, claims for power beyond what belongs to the office, and how do Christians respond?
Well, I really do. The power reductionism, I see it on both sides. Again, I analyze some of the big theorists are on the left, but the other side is doing it too. The idea that getting power, staying in power, that's the only thing that matters, and that moral issues or even the use of power directed towards justice, power controlled by law, controlled by the Constitution. These things are getting short shrift really on both sides. And I'm really dismayed, to tell the truth, by the election. And when you're constructivist, and again, both sides show that constructivism, where they interpret everything. Our catechism talks about putting the best construction on everything, putting the worst construction on everything has become a tactic, a political tactic you see in the rhetoric of both sides. And the fact that neither side is willing to accept the legitimacy of the other if the other side wins the election, that's very dangerous in a democracy. And I think part of our problem is that in losing our biblical worldview, our understanding that there is truth, that there is proper authority, that there are absolutes. I don't know if you can have a free democratic nation on the basis of power reductionism and constructivism. So, yeah, I'm depressed about both sides. So, when the election is over, it may put us through these issues in a really dramatic and really destructive way. I'm hoping that it doesn't. But whichever side wins, I think we're still in big trouble.
Thank you. Another question, Stephen? Sure.
Here's a comment from Paul Dorr that came up after Dr. Doss's talk. It says, from Iowa, no question, but a comment. Though it's reformed, this book is great for kids going off to college, and it's entitled 75 Bible Questions Your Instructors Pray You Never Ask. And it's by Gary North. And I'll go ahead and I can post the thing in the chat here, but there's a link to GaryNorth.com, 75BibleQuestions.pdf and so forth. So,
yeah, actually,
sorry,
both Dr. Doss and Dr. McPherson could respond to that with the questions and answers we're coming up with too, if you want to.
Sure, I won't give any answers. I'll just give you a preview of one of the things that the Center for Apologetics and Worldview Studies is aiming to do, and that is to develop some, I guess you could call them Q&A pamphlets. Here's a question and here's an answer. And we're thinking of like a two-sided, sheet that's a PDF that can be available on the internet that a pastor could print out and use as a Bible study in church, that you can share on social media with your friends, maybe an audio edition that would be a podcast, package it in different ways. But if you have questions that are driving you crazy, feel free to send them my way, because we can put them in the hopper. We already have a growing list, and we're also matching them up with authors in order to provide an ongoing set of resources for those of you who are in the front lines dealing with these things.
Yeah, could I add something to that? Several people on my Q&A asked online about, hey, how do we function in the university? I'm a grad student. How can we get through? And it seems like everybody believes the critical theory and all the rest. And let me just share what what I told them, most universities still have traditional scholars, old school scholars. And the fact is that a lot of professors really do not buy into the ideology that seems to be taking over their colleges. Many of them are afraid to speak out, and in many ways they're in the position of the dissident academics under the Soviet Union. But I found that almost everywhere you can find dissenters or dissidents from these ideologies. And if you're at a university, if you're in a graduate program, you can usually find them out, and they can be your good allies, and you can continue to do real scholarship, even in if the sort of establishment denies all truth and denies all learning as it's traditionally understood. So not everyone buys into this, although again, many are afraid to say anything.
Thank you. Another question, Stephen, from online?
Sure. I'm going to put this is so. We had a few questions that Dr. VEITH answered, typed in, but I think they're worth reiterating or asking so that they can be enjoyed by those in house as well. So of course, as you say, Dr. VEITH can answer them as he already did, or other panelists as well. It's from Thomas Kuster. He asked, "You are not denying that oppression happens, nor that Scripture many times enjoins Christian believers to identify with the oppressed over against their oppressors. How do you distinguish this Christian imperative from the spirits of the age that you have described negatively?"
Right. Well, what I said is that it's true. Again, that comment a while ago about the essential human nature versus the sin that corrupts it, and the corruption does not erase the value of the human being, and that's what we have to remember. My question: yes, there is sin, there is oppression, there's social injustice, there's moral issues that are extremely important that should motivate a Christian's political actions and their everyday lives. What I said, though, is that the difference is that a Christian, while recognizing oppression, should not oppress anyone else. You know, if you're a critical theorist, that's the only possibility. If you're oppressed, you need to seize power. And since all power is oppressive, that puts you in the position of being the oppressor. And that's what you should work for. And so you see in these circles the desire to not just disagree with your opponents, but punish them, silence them, cancel them, make them lose their jobs. And that is a vicious circle that critical theory, I don't think, can get away from. Christians, though, have a bigger perspective that allows us to morally criticize the oppression, identify with the oppressors, or with oppressed people, and work to improve their situation as we love and serve our neighbors. But the Christian ought not turn into an oppressor. We believe there's an option to oppress. If a Christian has power, the power can be used, as the traditional political theorists have always said, for justice. I don't see any possibility of justice in the power reductionism that sees all power as oppression. There can't be any justice, because whatever you do, that too will be oppressive. But again, Christians, I think, have a framework for positive action and for alleviating, to at least some degree, the evils that are are everywhere in fallen human beings and their societies.
If anybody has a question from the in-person audience, please come up to the mic as well. Otherwise, we'll just, yes, please come.
My name is Caleb Schultz. I'm a teacher in Moline, Illinois. And I guess this question kind of goes out to all of you who have kids, but mostly to Dr. Das. What did you do for disciplining your kids? Because there's a lot of different ways to do it, and I was just curious what you used.
Well, it was really easy. I'd be the law, and my wife would be the gospel. I think they still think of it in those terms. No, I mean, we often in Lutheranism, we talk about, we're really stuck on the forensic elements. And I've talked about this often, that we're interested in what Christ did for us. But it's not just what Christ did for us. And so when you read the scriptures, let's say you're reading Paul's letters or all throughout the New Testament, there are two patterns of thought that are interwoven. There's a forensic, what God has done for us, but there's also what God does through us and in us, the participatory. And so we have to, if you will, restore the full counsel of Scripture. And so some of this comes forth in our parenting, that I think of parenting as embodied parenting, that we embody in that moment, prayerfully, the Lord to our kids. So when I talk about the righteous anger at the temple over sin, there may be righteous anger in our own household, but it's also the gospel takes precedence over the law, and it's in the context of the love and the relationship. So we always have to make sure that there's that love and the relationship there. And so, that balance between law and gospel is something that's also embodied in our parenting. And so there are times when the law is necessary. And I think it's, we talk about pastors who have to know the distinction between law and gospel. How much more the parent?
Another question online, Stephen?
Sure. There's a couple of questions that were asked during Dr. V's talk, but I think they're good ones to also open up to everybody. And one of them is from Holly Vanutka. I feel like the destruction of what is going on in our society today is based on the breakdown of the family unit. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agreed with her, and talked about, and sometimes Christians have not really cultivated the family unit as they ought to, as God's design has, and the vocation to see the family relationship as vocation, as callings for us to love and serve our neighbors are very important. So I agreed with her. I'd be curious what other people had to say. They might be able to offer her more ideas than I did.
Anyone?
Just to speak a word of agreement. I mean, am I live?
Yes.
Okay. I would simply agree wholeheartedly that to grasp our vocation as parents, to look at the table of duties that we see in books like 1 Peter or Ephesians, that to see that this is our high and holy priestly calling. I mean, one of the things that always strikes me in reading 1 Peter is that you have this description of that you're a royal priesthood, a chosen generation, and you almost think, well, what does that mean? We're children of miracle and wonder. We're going to be floating above the earth. Nobody will see us. We'll just float right up to heaven. And then Peter brings everything down to earth with the incarnation of Jesus, the sufferings of Jesus. And then he says, now go, and wives, love your husbands, and slaves, serve your masters. That within that holy space that we find in the ordinary of every day is the place where we love and serve one another. And to recapture the beauty of family is crucial for our age, has to be.
Use the word vocation, and if you haven't already read Gene Veith's excellent book, God at Work, I think it's called God at Work, Your Christian Calling in All of Life, or something like that. Please do so, because he unpacks vocation very well there. Several of us also have used the phrase legitimate authority, and I think now with this question here on the breakdown of the family, we can bring those things together and consider that our vocations, where God places us, the office of fatherhood, the office of motherhood, the office of grandparents, as we heard in Dr. Das's talk as well. God establishes that kind of order with a legitimate authority for the purpose of dispensing his blessings. I talked for a while about the church and the state as two distinct spheres for God's blessings. And the family is yet a third. Sometimes the reformers call them the three estates, the family being one of them. And each has its own role. They overlap a little bit, and that's where it gets delicate and dicey, because you don't want them to conflict, but rather to support each other. When we live in the culture we live in now, which we've heard the term postmodern and post-Christian today, we could also add post-family. Because marriages are weak if they happen at all. Children, if they're born at all and let to live, often are being raised only with one parent home for a variety of reasons. And people are sometimes the perpetrator and sometimes the victim and sometimes both. But beyond the blame game, God has come to restore. And he calls on the church to help to restore the family. Not to replace, not to supplant, but to supplement. And so if you think of it in that framework, I can't give you all the details and how you're going to solve it in your local level, but think of it as God's desire to have that order where you have the church and the state and the family, and where families are weak, that we step in and boost them up, but not to replace them, but to restore them, not to supplant them, but to supplement them. If you have that mindset in mind, I think God will place people in your midst whom you can serve, and you'll know what to do.
Another question, Stephen?
Sure. Here's a good one. A brand new question for sort of everybody from Andrew Burmeister. Not just parents and current or future college students, but thinking of aspiring young men and women to be professors at colleges and universities, and not just our synodical or liberal arts institutions. What are all your thoughts about educated people going into that battleground? I'm not, personally, this is Stephen speaking, I regret asking for all of anyone's thoughts on something, but.
Yeah, well, I'll start. Again, it's a matter of vocation, and if God is calling a person into the academic life, and that includes equipping the person and having doors open or slam in your face, and gives you the opportunity to be in that in those fields, I think God is going to be there with you and to support you in that. I believe that Christians need to be in the academic fields and in the disciplines where these bad ideas are emerging. If Christians desert the academy, then there will be less Christianity there, by definition. And I think it's possible for Christians to thrive in these very difficult environments sometimes. But like I said, these ideas really are very weak. And there's already dissent about them in the academy. And Christians need to be a part of that to offer better ideas. And I think that is a very important Christian calling these days. And Christianity, kept learning alive after the fall of the Rome, when the barbarians were moving in, destroying libraries and destroying education. And I think we're kind of in that position again. And Christians dare not let their heritage and the educational accomplishments of our civilization perish to the barbarians. It's up to us, and whether we do that in traditional universities, whether we do that in synodical schools and Christian schools, and I think they play a very important role and are doing important work today, or whether it's just individuals reading the good books on their own and teaching them to their children. I think that's an important work today, and it's something that Christians are called, that some Christians at least are called to.
Thank you. Maybe I'll respond to that as well, too. Dr. Veith, you, in at least a couple of your books, talked about the University of Babylon, where you find Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Yeah.
And I think very appropriately so. I mean, they were there. They didn't have any choice, but they were there, and they were very effective in that culture. And I do think we need more Daniels in the teaching area, especially higher education. I sometimes refer to Andrew Doss as the Daniel at where he's at, and I commend him for that. At the same time, there's a warning here, downside. If Christians go into teaching in a profession, in a college or university, but they are not well grounded in the Christian worldview and Christian doctrine, it can be disastrous. I mean, even if I've noticed this sometimes, I think, even in Christian institutions where professors come to teach, and they may be of the same fellowship, or they may have very conservative perspective, but they've been unduly influenced by certain worldviews, and so they don't quite teach the whole counsel of God, or they miss a big portion of it, and they can even it can even be detrimental to Christians within a Christian institution. So and that's part of the reason for this Worldview Conference, and this is part of the reason why I asked Dr. Doss to present on what he did and so forth. So.
I can offer a comment on that as well. Being a research scientist at Northwestern University, I had, this is more of a story. I had my roommate in graduate school was also a conservative confessional Christian, but of a missionary Baptist persuasion. We had some interesting discussions. And we took two different paths. Neither of them I would consider so noble as Dr. Doss in being a constant warrior. My path ended up being, both of us with a biochemistry doctorate. My path took me toward the technical, toward the being an instrumental scientist, and supporting, frankly, a lot more physicists in that type of research, and chose not to collaborate with anyone who was sort of making, any sort of evolutionary arguments in their results or discussions of their papers, which are just the norm, even if that's not your main topic. He, however, took more of an approach of choosing to use the language of evolution in his papers, basically matching that of, though he did not privately believe in evolution, or at least as he expressed to me, he still used that language in the papers. And I felt that was disingenuous at best, and counterproductive at worst. Of course, and that's my professional path has taken me not so high a level. I've never been a professor. I simply am more of a support research scientist. But I prefer that to tying my wagon to any of these other sort of arguments. And I stick more to the physics side of things and stuff that can actually be proven by experimental observation.
We have another question. Adam, you want to come forward?
My name is Adam Gowell, pastor in Chicago. Question especially for Dr. MacPherson. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. Just kind of struggling with thinking about Romans 13, and I appreciate the historical background of kind of the Christian, Germany and Norway in various time periods. In the first century, the Roman Empire was absolutely not Christian, and the empire was or would soon be torturing and executing Christians. Just thinking about having myself spent time in a authoritarian or totalitarian country and where Christians are persecuted, and so how I can kind of understand when you're given certain freedoms in a constitutional democracy, you might be constitutionally allowed to resist certain tyrannies, but what if you're living under an authority that is a totalitarian or an authoritarian authority?
That's an excellent question. Thank you. So in the first century, you're right. Rome was, or at least at certain times, it was totalitarian. It was against the church at various times, and especially in the centuries that followed, that usually became worse. Romans 13 itself already was a blow to the cult of the Roman Empire. The idea that the emperor is divine, and in the years, Dr. Das could explain the chronology better than I can of when this all broke out. But the idea, when the Christians were persecuted, when they were going to be thrown to the lions or the gladiators or whatever the case may be, often what was said was, well, just this day when we have this special feast, worship the emperor on this day, and then you can go back to Jesus the next day. And of course, Christianity isn't a both and sort of thing, right? We believe in one true God. And so that just gives you a picture a little bit for context. But what that also means is that when Paul was writing Romans 13, he was not saying unconditional obedience to the state, no matter how totalitarian the state becomes, but he actually already was limiting the state itself. And so again, if you read especially into verses 3 and 4 that describe the purpose to protect the innocent and to punish the evildoer, but also even in verse 1 or so, you've got this idea of all authority is established from God and comes from God. And I mean, ultimately, I think if you read the words there, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking that at least one use of the word authority actually refers to God as the ultimate authority. And then it's on that basis that God in turn delegates some of it to the state, you see? And so you may want to comment further because you're an expert on Pauline literature. But that would be my response. In other words, what I put together in that article in the Lutheran Sentinel, which is applied to the American Constitution, I think those principles apply directly over to every other context, including Paul, who appeals to Caesar at some point, right? So that's his version of filing a lawsuit, so to speak, right? Of saying, take me to court. I have rights as a Roman citizen. And so he's trying to work within the system that was established there, that there were some checks and balances against tyranny even in that system. And Christians needn't be afraid to make use of those. We also might choose not to make full use of those. That was in the Magdeburg Confession too, right? Choose to bear patiently, to be charitable, to give space. But we do have that option to make full use of legitimate authority. In your hymnals, if you want to pull it out later, you're going to find the Augsburg Confession, open it up to Article 16. And it says how it's a Christian thing to serve as a judge or as a soldier, to make use of lawful civil ordinances is the phrasing there. And so even under Rome, Christians could do that.
I think we want to wrap things up pretty soon here. So if we have another question, or maybe
I have
two.
one online. I have an online one for you. From Joel in Mequon. Any ideas about how our culture can at one time seek to overturn the created order and escape its necessary outcomes, while exalting science as the highest instrument for attaining truth? Doesn't this paradox run contrary to the assumptions which make science possible?
So I would say, yes, it does. And this is an example of what I've said, that the prevailing ideas are ultimately contradicting themselves. You cannot have science if you cannot know objective truth, or if there is no objective truth, or if objective truth is just something we construct or our culture constructs. It does contradict science. It undermines technology, which people are still wanting to depend on. And that's just an example. In my book, Post-Christian, I kind of go into this more and talk about what's happening in the sciences, as well as some other disciplines. And so the fact is, we have reality on our side. And reality always breaks in on people who try to hide from it. And so that's a reason I think we can be somewhat optimistic, at least in the long term, and why we don't think we have to figure out what to do about ourselves, because the whole edifice may be coming down. And so we can enjoy watching that happen.
Maybe I'll throw out one last question. And this was alluded to very clearly, I should say, not just alluded to, but in both Kareem's presentation and Andrew's presentation, and I'm thinking about Matthew chapter 10, where Jesus points out that, if they called Christ a particular name, and it's the worst name you could be called, basically, is it Beelzebul there? Matthew 10? Don't be surprised if you Christians are called names too. And so when you look at that, when we're called names, and we are called names, we can almost wear them as a badge of honor, which is perhaps better understood in some cultures than maybe here at the present time. Kareem, would you like to speak to that?
As I said in my presentation, it depends how we react to this accusation or name calling. Today in our culture, it's very hard to live in America now with all this, I have my freedom, and who are you to call me that or tell me that? And it's very confusing actually to even accept the other. It's very hard time even to communicate with other people. There's no acceptance, so it's really hard to comprehend the idea of people calling us names. In Syria, I guess, as I said, it becomes part of your identity when, as I said, my ancestors just pushed from Diyarbakir, moved to Syria because of the genocide. Now history repeats itself. Syrians, Christians pushed away from Syria. So the idea of persecution is always there. It's a question that you wake up every day, every morning, sometimes asking yourself. And ask myself this question many times, and sometimes it's a joke, like if today somebody, ISIS or somebody comes and ask me to deny Jesus, am I ready to die for my faith? So it's kind of, you live with this statement, with this question. You keep asking yourself this question all the time. You have to accept that reality, that you have to be persecuted. But that's what the Bible told us, regardless, if you live in Syria, if you live in US, if you live in anywhere else. You have to accept that you will be persecuted no matter what you do. Whether you accept it or not, that's a different question.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. And we will, for the second time, end our conference here. I will, in about 15, 20 minutes, have the Office of Compliance. So if any of you would like to stay for a 10-minute worship, 12-minute worship service, you may do so. But again, I want to thank the presenters, both, Paul and Jean and Andrew and Ryan and Kareem, thank you so much. I think it was very beneficial and helpful. I'm sure that most everybody thought it was a tremendous conference. That's the word I've heard so far anyway. Again, thank you. The Lord's blessings, Godspeed on your way home, and hope to see you all again sometime soon.